Hello, yay, it works. Welcome everybody, good evening. I'm Gabriela Chavarria, I'm the director at the Burke Museum of Natural History, here to welcome you all to this amazing evening. And I would like to start our meeting, our lecture tonight, with our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish peoples, whose ancestors have resided here since time immemorial. And many indigenous peoples continue to thrive well and alive in this area. And we have in the Burke, we always do a small reflection after the land acknowledgement. And my reflection today, as I see this hall pretty much almost full, and that I see all the multi-generational here, and we see the children, the college students, a lot of our members from the Burke. I just, totally delighted that you are decided to spend your evening, with us. And I also, wanted to start by saying thank you to our great sponsors, Rosemary Habernack and Nathan Merble, who are here today with us. And through the years, they have, provided us the resources to have these incredible lectures, to bring these incredible paleontologists, to inspire all of us and inspire the next generation to really connect with paleontology. So thank you, Rosemary. Thank you, Nathan. And I know we all came here to hear our speaker. So I am going to introduce not the speaker, but somebody very special to the Burke. And he is currently he's our Associate Director of Research and Collections, Dr. Greg Wilson Mantilla, who is also a faculty in the Department of Biology. He's a vertebrate paleontologist. An incredible research. Several of his graduate students and undergraduates are here. He has really mentoring and training the next generation of scholars in this field. But also, he is the director of the Dig Field School. And I know many of the teachers have heard of the Dig Field or have participated in the Dig Field. So we are, really delighted that Greg has continued to spearhead this lecture and that he invites some of his most amazing friends to come and share the work with us. Greg.
I have an important announcement about a pair of glasses that were left at the reception. They're up here. Come grab them afterwards. Gabby, thank you for that introduction. I am so excited. Thank you all for coming. We have an amazing, awesome treat today. I am so excited to introduce Dr. Jingmai O'Connor. We're very, very lucky to have her. She and the Archaeopteryx from the Field Museum have been the absolute hottest story in paleontology in the moment. If you haven't been paying attention to it, it's really amazing, so look that up later. But even before the announcement of the Field Museum's gorgeous specimen, Jingmai was a paleo superstar and still is. We're very lucky to have her. She got her start in Southern California at Occidental College, where she first worked on fossil mammals. I love it. But for some reason, she decided to switch over to a different clade to do her PhD work. She worked with past Dino lecture speaker Luis Chiappe at the University of Southern California. That's where she did her PhD. And she focused there on the early evolution of birds. In particular, she has been very, very fortunate to work on some amazingly complete specimens from the famous fossil beds, the Mesozoic fossil beds of China. You'll see some of those, I'm sure. She would then, after her PhD, go on to do a postdoc at the renowned IVPP in China. She did such amazing work that transitioned into a professorship there. And she produced a lot of amazing papers. And she was recognized, winning one of paleontology's top honors, the Schuchert Award. The Field Museum seized the moment and snatched her up and hired her as the associate curator of fossil reptiles in 2020. And she is there now and doing amazing stuff. But beyond her paradigm-shifting research on the evolution of birds, which you'll hear all about, Jingmai has throughout her career unabashedly shattered the mold of that stodgy old scientist. She's even been dubbed the punk rock paleontologist. And I think something that she should be very proud of is that she's also been a leader in smoothing the path for a much more diverse community in the field of paleontology. I've been lucky enough to spend some time with her out in the field in Montana, and in the last few days also in the museum, and it's been a true pleasure for me. And you are going to absolutely love Jingmai's passion and her dazzling story of the evolutionary journey of birds. So please help me in welcoming Jingmai O'Connor.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Gabby. Thank you, Greg, for this wonderful introduction. I want to say I've given, quite a few public lectures in my day, but this has been such a wonderfully warm and welcoming community, and you are all so lucky to be part of it. Before I begin, I want to say I heard Cascadia Elementary is in the house. Yes! Awesome. It is so wonderful that you are starting your journey of scientific discovery at 4th grade. That is wonderful. I didn't discover paleo until I was in college, and I always feel like everyone who got this early start, I always feel like you know so much more than me. So that's really wonderful to be interested in science so young. So thank you all for spending your Thursday evening with me. I'm going to do my best to live up to the expectations of Greg and Gabby, who have been so kind to introduce me. Now, when I give a talk like this, I like to begin with a basic question. So, are dinosaurs extinct? If you think dinosaurs are extinct, please raise your hand. All right. Yeah, okay, so not a majority of people, and if you raise your hand, don't feel bad. Most of us are taught over and over again that dinosaurs are creatures of the past, dinosaurs are extinct. But in fact, dinosaurs are the most diverse group of land vertebrate animals on our planet. There are anywhere between 9,000 and 11,000 species of living dinosaurs. I've even seen some estimates upward of 20,000 species of birds. I don't necessarily buy that. I lean towards more about 10,000. But if you consider diversity to be a measure of success, then you could consider that dinosaurs today, right now, are the most successful group of land vertebrates on our planet. And how birds first evolved from among small, feathered theropod dinosaurs in the Jurassic and eventually became the only group of dinosaurs to survive the end Cretaceous mass extinction is the fascinating realm of my area of research. So, as Greg alluded to, maybe some of you have heard about the Field Museum's recent and I think very exciting announcement of their acquisition of the 13th skeletal specimen of Archaeopteryx. Now, Archaeopteryx is the first ever Mesozoic bird that was ever found, and it was found in 1861, And now, 163 years later, no other bird has ever been found from Jurassic-aged deposits. So this is the first piece of evidence we have for understanding one of nature's great success stories, the evolution of birds. But as Greg also mentioned, for 10 years before I went to the Field Museum and was given this great honor to study this beautiful Archaeopteryx, I spent 10 years in Beijing. And China is home to all the second oldest fossil birds that we know of, which come from the early Cretaceous, as well as the dinosaurs most closely related to birds. They all come from China, and they number in the thousands. And when you have that many specimens to work with, there are so many interesting biological details that you can understand that paleontologists, that are typically elusive to paleontologists. So because I have had the opportunity to work on the only Jurassic bird, as well as thousands of the oldest Cretaceous birds, it's given me unique insight into the early evolution of birds, which I would like to share with you this evening. Now, to truly understand exactly how birds are dinosaurs, I think it's important to look at birds and dinosaurs in a phylogenetic context. So apologies to everyone for this, to whom this is very basic, but I would like to walk you through a simplified phylogeny of tetrapod life on our planet. And a phylogeny is a representation not only of evolutionary history, but of the relationships between different groups of organisms. So here I have drawn a simplified phylogeny of amniotes. And these are all tetrapods that have evolved to be able to reproduce away from water due to the presence of an amniotic egg. So this is basically all tetrapods with the exception of amphibians, which still need to reproduce in water. Now, if we look at amniotes, which are land vertebrates, there are two major lineages. We have our synapsids and our reptiles. Now, we're all familiar with the term reptile, but maybe we're not so familiar with the word synapsid. But synapsid includes mammals like us. Be excellent to each other, that's my life motto, and party on, okay? But it also includes a huge diversity of non-mammalian synapsids, like Dimetrodon. I'm sure a lot of you maybe thought Dimetrodon was a dinosaur or closely related to dinosaurs, but in fact it is a distant relative of dinosaurs and a close relative of us. Now, if you look at reptiles, there are two major lineages. There are your lepidopsaurs and your archosaurs. And your lepidopsaurs include living members like snakes and lizards, but also, of course, include a whole diversity of extinct animals, including mosasaurs, which actually are probably varanid lizards that evolved to become aquatic. And if you look at archosaurs, again, you're looking at two major lineages. Pseudosuchians, which include the only living members are basically your crocodilians, like alligators, crocs, and gharials, but of course, again, include a huge diversity of extinct animals that were probably all warm-blooded, by the way. And then if you look at the other lineage of archosaurs, it's our ornithodyrans, and that includes pterosaurs and dinosaurs, as well as other extinct groups. Now, if we focus now on dinosaurs, there's this wonderful diversity of shape and form and size, right? We all love dinosaurs because of their wonderful different, frills and crests and all these, and their enormous size. But birds are just one group of dinosaurs nested within a group we call Theropoda. But birds are the group of dinosaurs that survive the most recent non-human mass extinction in Earth's history, the 5th mass extinction triggered by a meteor impact. So why were birds the only dinosaurs to survive? Now, it's one thing that is important to recognize is that not all birds survive. In fact, during the Cretaceous, there were many lineages of birds, but only one lineage survives. We call this lineage Neornithes, and all birds that are alive today are a member of this group. So what set this group apart, not only from non-avian dinosaurs, but set them apart from the other birds that were living at the same time? I hypothesize that the same characteristics that allowed Neornithine birds to survive this catastrophic event are the same characteristics that allowed Neornithines to explosively radiate in the earliest part of the Cenozoic to become the most diverse group of land vertebrates on our planet that we recognize today. So birds are the most modified group of amniotes on our planet. They are so modified that it's not until fairly recently that we recognize that they are reptiles, right? I mean, when I was a kid in school, we were taught, there's mammals, reptiles, and birds. But now we recognize birds are reptiles. But they are so modified because of their form of locomotion, powered flight. And powered flight is the most physically demanding form of vertebrate locomotion. And because of all the demands of this very difficult form of locomotion, basically every part of their body has been modified in some way. Modified to the point that not only are birds capable of this very difficult form of locomotion, they're capable of flying over the Himalayas that are littered with the bodies of the wealthy mountaineers who thought that they could conquer the highest point on our planet. And not only can birds fly over the Himalayas, one of my favorite articles was this short note published in 1973 in which a plane flying at cruising altitude, 37,000 feet in the air, crashed into some poor vulture just minding his own business. So at an elevation where no mammal could survive, where we could not get enough oxygen to survive, birds are still capable of the most oxygen-demanding form of locomotion, powered flight. So what are the characteristics so that we recognize that have of birds that reflect their enormous adaptations for this very specific form of locomotion? So we've all seen birds outside our window. So what are some of their unique characteristics? Please go ahead, start shouting out some things. What is special about birds? Feathers, yes, more. I love you guys. Yes. Okay, thank you. The last audience that I asked for participation, I got just dead silence. So thank you so much for participating. I love your enthusiasm. So I have created a list of some of the most obvious modifications of birds, of characteristics of birds that set them apart from other living animals. And so I put it from obvious to most obvious. So for example, unless you've dissected a bird, you're probably not aware of the fact that they have 2 stomachs, whereas most amniotes have 1. But right at the top of the list, we have feathers. I definitely heard feathers from many of you guys. It's one of the most distinctive characteristics of birds. But because birds have feathers, and feathers are dead structures, but they're so important to the biology of birds, not only for flight, but to protect them from UV radiation or for things like camouflage, birds have to replace their feathers regularly in order to maintain their function. So another unique characteristic of birds is their annual molt. So for example, most reptiles will shed their skin more than one time of year, but for birds, it's once a year. Of course, birds not only have feathers, but they have feathers forming wings that they use for flight. And also, no bird has teeth. All birds have an edentulous, a toothless, horny beak. Also, birds have a wishbone or a furcula, which are your collarbones fused into a single U-shaped element. Birds also have an abbreviated tail that ends in a fused element called a pygostyle. So it's actually very similar to the human coccyx, because like birds, we also had an ancestor with an elongate bony tail. Birds are also the only animals that lay eggs that have colored eggs. Birds also have, we mammals are warm-blooded, but birds are hot-blooded. I always have to control myself to not say hot blooded. All right, and then I just did it anyways. Gosh darn it. All right, and they have high metabolic rates that actually allows them to grow very quickly. So maybe you don't know this, but most birds grow to adult size within a year, and most of them do it in a matter of just a few weeks. And this is possible because of their very high metabolism. They're also the only amniotes with a single functional ovary and oviduct. We have two. Other living archosaurs like crocodilians have two ovaries and oviducts. They are also the only egg-laying reptiles that use their own body heat to incubate their eggs. And they also have a very specialized lung that has these air sacs that extend off their lungs and invade into their bones in order to make them very lightweight, which makes it easier for them to fly. And birds are also capable of moving food in between different parts of their digestive tract. So many of us, when we were in maybe about third grade, we dissected an owl pellet, right? So that is evidence of birds' ability to move things from the stomach in the opposite direction that food normally goes. Yes, we're all capable of vomiting when we don't feel well, but that's not a normal behavior. It's something that we do to protect ourselves. But birds can move things in between the different parts of the digestive system, which makes their digestive system very efficient. And birds, as I mentioned, have this two-part stomach, and their esophagus is also specialized into a food storage pouch, basically, which allows them to ingest more food than their stomach is able to hold. Now, the more we have learned about the dinosaurs very closely related to birds, the more we have realized that many of the characteristics that we think of as uniquely avian characteristics are actually characteristics that birds inherited from non-avian dinosaurs. And the most obvious, of course, is feathers. So in the late 1990s, the first feathered dinosaurs were found in China, and these fossils showed us that not only did birds inherit feathers from the dinosaurs most closely related to them, but they also inherited the wing-like arrangement of feathers on the arms. That evolved in non-flying dinosaurs for some other purpose that we're not quite sure about, and birds inherited this structure. Now, the more we learned about feathered dinosaurs from China, the more we realized that only 3 groups of theropod dinosaurs had feathers like we see in living birds. And these are the oviraptorosaurs, the dromaeosaurids, and the troodontids. And when we looked closely at this particular group of dinosaurs, which together we call Pene-Raptora, we saw additional evidence of features that were bird-like features that birds inherited from these dinosaurs. For example, here is an oviraptorosaur that at the very least is providing us evidence of very high degrees of parental care, like we see in living birds, but also very possibly showing us evidence of contact incubation. So possibly that is also a feature that birds inherited from non-avian dinosaurs. Some really interesting research by a young and brilliant scientist named Yasmina Veman also shows that the colored egg that is today unique to birds is again something that actually appeared only in Pene-Raptoran dinosaurs and is something birds inherited from these non-avian theropods. If, again, looking at these Pene-Raptorans, we even see additional tangible evidence of the dinosaur-bird connection. So here is a little troodontid named Mei Long, which means sleeping dragon in Chinese. And if you look at this is one of my favorite fossils. So here is the head. This is where the eye would sit. This is the tail. It wraps all the way around the body. And this is the neck leading to the head. And this is one of the wings. So we are looking at a little sleeping dinosaur that is sleeping with its head tucked underneath its wing the exact same way that most living birds sleep. Not penguins, obviously. They got like really short necks. They can't do that. But, yeah, but most birds sleep this way. And this is just really awesome evidence that shows us that so many of these bird characteristics were actually characteristic of a more inclusive group of dinosaurs. We also have direct evidence, again, from that brilliant scientist, Yasmina Viman. You guys should invite her next time. She's done analyses that actually show us that these elevated metabolic rates were ancestral to all of dinosaurs. In fact, they were ancestral to the common ancestor of birds and pterosaurs. They were warm-blooded, though some dinosaurs, like, for example, stegosaurs, ceratopsians, and ornithopods, they secondarily evolved to be cold-blooded. We also have evidence from, if we find very tight clusters of numerous gastroliths preserved within the abdominal cavity, this allows us to hypothesize that these stones are gizzard stones. And if you have gizzard stones, you have a gastric mill, and you can only have a gastric mill if you've evolved this two-part stomach. You can only have a grinding gizzard that uses ingested stones to grind up your food if you had a two-chambered stomach. Now, I was told once while giving a talk to children, and since there's a lot of fourth graders in the room, I want to say, do not eat stones, okay? Birds can do this, mammals cannot. No, I'm not saying birds are better, but maybe they are. I'm just kidding. But please, nobody eat stones. I don't want to get in trouble. But this, the presence of these gastric mills in non-avian dinosaurs tells us again that the two-chambered stomach is not something unique to birds. It was inherited from non-avian dinosaurs. Though I do want to say the gastric mill in birds is proportionately smaller than it is in non-avian, non-flying dinosaurs. And this probably reflects the constraints of flight. Flight requires so much energy, and the heavier you are, the more energy it requires. So we see that the gastric mill in birds is smaller, it's less heavy. So this is reflecting how flight, the appearance of flight has changed birds. And we also have evidence that non-avian dinosaurs were, like birds, capable of egesting, of moving food in the opposite direction that food normally goes, of egesting pellets like we see in mammals. So here is a dinosaur called Anchiornis. It's probably a troodontid. It's very closely related to birds, and inside its throat is a pellet of lizard bones that we hypothesize was about to be egested. And this is very efficient for birds because bones and feathers and hair and things are very difficult to digest. They take a very long time. So rather than carrying around all these parts of the animal that are very difficult to digest, birds just egest them and get rid of them in order to keep themselves lightweight to make it easier for them to fly. Now, if you look at Archaeopteryx, which is the oldest and most primitive or most basal bird, you'll also find that there are a lot of bird characteristics that are absent in the oldest bird. So, for example, it doesn't have that abbreviated tail that I mentioned. It has an elongate reptilian tail. And if you were to look at the jaws, our Archaeopteryx has 52 teeth. So it does not have this edentulous beak that we associate with birds. So if we take a look at this list of supposedly bird characteristics, you'll see that most of these characteristics are actually things that are actually characteristics of a more inclusive group of dinosaurs. They are not unique to birds. If we look at all life on our planet through time, they're characteristics that birds inherited from their non-avian dinosaurian relatives, but you'll also see that some characteristics were absent in the earliest birds. So this begs the question, what makes a bird a bird? And I hate when people ask me this question because the fact is we don't have an answer. So most of the time when paleontologists are defining one group or another, we have a set of skeletal anatomical traits, different parts of the skeleton that are all the same in this one group, and we use these to define the group. But we cannot do that for birds. There are no skeletal traits that we can use to draw the line between a bird, the oldest bird, and a non-avian dinosaur. So the only way we have currently to define birds as a group is what we call a phylogenetic definition. So we say the common ancestor of a house sparrow, which I'm sure you've all seen, and Archaeopteryx, the common ancestor of these two species, and all its descendants, those are birds. But we can't actually give you a list of characteristics that make that group different from other dinosaurs. But that's because if you look at my list, the only things that haven't been shown to be present or inherited from non-avian dinosaurs or absent in the earliest birds are soft tissue characteristics that are not usually recorded in the fossil record. So you'll notice one of them is flight. I'm going to have to say flight is the subject of a whole separate lecture. It deserves its own lecture. So if you guys want to learn about flight, you're going to have to invite me back, and I won't be sad about that. You guys live in a beautiful city. But for this talk, I'm going to focus on the annual molt, the single ovary and oviduct, and the esophageal crop. Now, the deposits in which we get this type of soft tissue information, in which we actually get records of characteristics that we don't normally get in paleontology, are deposits that we call Lagerstätten. So Lagerstätten is a German word. It means storage place, and it refers to geological units, like units of rock, that are characterized by exceptional preservation. So exceptional preservation in paleontology usually means that you have a fairly complete fossil. Most of the time, fossils are incomplete, meaning the skeleton, maybe you only have one bone, maybe you only have half a bone. If you're lucky, you have more than that, but it's rare to get complete fossils. And if you're especially lucky, the bones are articulated. And this means that the hip bone is connected to the leg bone. It means that the bones are in a lifelike position. And this is kind of, this gives us additional information that we're always very lucky to have. But in the exceptional of the exceptional cases, the preservation extends beyond just the skeleton to also include soft tissues that normally don't work their way into the fossil record. So here we have a specimen of a bird called Sapiornis. I'll tell you about it later. But you can see that the entire soft tissue body of this bird is carbonized. And it probably covered this thing in 3 dimensions and was prepped away. I don't want to think about that. But we also, yeah, I know. But it also has feathers, so it has additional soft tissue. It's also got stomach contents. So this kind of exceptional specimen tells us so much more about the biology of this bird that lived 120 million years ago than we normally get when we paleontologists are working with fossils. Now, the deposits in Germany that have yielded Archaeopteryx are also Lagerstätten. The Solnhofen limestones are basically lagoons that became hypersaline. Basically, they were cut off from the rest of the ocean, so the salinity in these lagoons rose, so that nothing could live in these bodies of water, so that anything that fell into it and died was really wonderfully preserved. So let's start with sharing some information about the new Chicago Archaeopteryx. Now, my museum decided to put the specimen on display as soon as preparation was finished, which means that I didn't have really time to do the research. So the research on this specimen is still in review in scientific journals. It hasn't been published yet. For the research, knock on wood, eventually getting accepted. But now I want to talk to you about the Cretaceous evolution of birds. So Archaeopteryx is the only Jurassic bird. All the other evidence we have for the Mesozoic evolution of birds comes from the Cretaceous. And most of this evidence comes from a deposit that has yielded what we call the jet-hole biota. So the jet-hole biota is found in a series of rocks that are between 130 and 120 million years old. And these record the second oldest fossil birds known to science, and they are 20 million years younger than Archaeopteryx, which which comes from the late Jurassic, about 150 million years ago. And if you look at these fossils from the Jehol biota, you will see that the exceptional preservation is not unique to the birds that I'm going to talk about to you today. We have exceptional preservation in lizards. Look at all the scales here. Even in the fish, we can see soft tissues. Look at the eyes on this amphibian. This psittacosaur dinosaur, maybe some of you recognize, it was famous in the news for preserving the scales surrounding its cloaca, which is basically like, anyways, look it up. But yeah, the butt. All right, thank you. I didn't want to say it. I was like, oh yeah. Anyways, but yeah, I mean, very cool. These fossils are amazing, and they gave us a wonderful glimpse into the biology of lots of different animals, not just feathered dinosaurs. But there's something really special about the avifauna, about the birds that come from this deposit. So, every other Cretaceous age deposit in the world that preserves bird fossils only preserves either enantiornithine bird fossils, which is the dominant group of birds in the Cretaceous, or ornithuromorph bird fossils. And ornithuromorpha is the group that includes modern birds, neornithines, nested within. So there are lots of deposits all over the world that have bird fossils from the Cretaceous, but they all only represent enantiornithines and ornithuromorphs. The Jehol avifauna, the Jehol biota, is the only fauna that preserves birds that are intermediate between Archaeopteryx and these more derived birds that for all intent and purposes look very, very similar to birds alive today. I mean, if you looked really closely, you'd be like, wait a minute, that bird's got teeth, and you would notice some differences. But this really is the only deposit in the world where we can understand these early major transformations in the bird. Because as I mentioned, Archaeopteryx doesn't look very bird-like at all, right? So let me introduce to you some of these really strange and curious birds from these early Cretaceous deposits. So Jehornis is the only bird other than Archaeopteryx that has an elongate bony tail. But compared to Archaeopteryx, the tail is longer, both in terms of overall length as well as in terms of the number of vertebrae that form the tail. But besides that, it has 3 claws on its hands, same as Archaeopteryx, but the hand is a little bit shorter, so that's like more like living birds. If you were to look at the shoulder girdle, you'd actually see that it looks almost like that of living birds. It has ossified sternal plates, which are absent in Archaeopteryx, so it has all these features that are more advanced than Archaeopteryx, but then it's got this really long bony tail. And this really puzzled people for the longest time until we finally found a specimen that preserved the tail feathers. And what that made us realize is that counterintuitively, the elongate tail in Jehornis is actually a flight adaptation. Then we have all these lineages of the earliest birds to have an abbreviated tail. So here we're looking at a bird called Sapiornis. You guys seen this one before. And Sapiornis has now only 2 fingers on its hand. We also have a much longer arm, which again we associate with the development of the wing. And it has a pygostyle that looks almost exactly like a living bird. But like Archaeopteryx, it has no ossified sternum. And the sternum is the breastbone where the flight muscles attach. So we hypothesized Archaeopteryx and Sapiornis were flying, but where were the flight muscles attaching? This is what keeps me up at night. And here we have another group of basal pygostylians. This is the Confucius ornithiform. So there are a bunch of different taxa together that make this family. Most specimens are referable to a taxon called Confucius ornis. Now, Confucius ornis, like Jehornis, has a ossified sternum, and but if you look at its hand, it has 3 claws, like Archaeopteryx and like Jehornis, but the claws are huge. They're bigger than even what we see in non-avian dinosaurs. And if you were to look at the pygostyle, it's nothing like the pygostyle of a living bird. It's this massive rod-like bone. So what I hope that I'm conveying to you in describing these features is that these fossils are not making it easy for us to understand what is going on in the evolution of birds, because you see like this crazy combination of very bird-like traits traits and then very primitive non-avian bird-like traits. And what this probably reflects is that these different lineages all radiated from each other and in parallel to each other were evolving to improve their flight apparatus. And because they're all trying to fly, they're evolving very similar features, but because they have their own independent evolutionary pathway, these features are appearing different in different lineages. And really just, like I said, keeping me from sleeping at night. But that's why I love paleo, the mystery. And here we're looking at the enantiornithines. The enantiornithines are the most dominant group of birds in the Cretaceous. If you find a fossil bird in Cretaceous age deposits, it's probably enantiornithine. More than half of all the species of Mesozoic birds that we know of belong to this group of birds. But these groups of birds, despite their diversity, are all small, arboreal birds. So you can actually kind of think of them as the Cretaceous passerines. Passerines, there are about 7,000 species of passerines, so they make up the majority of the species of birds alive today, and they're all mostly small and arboreal. Now, what's interesting is the ornithuromorphs, which remember is the group that eventually evolves into the birds that we see alive today. We have much fewer specimens, many fewer known species, but despite that we have less evidence, we see enormous ecological diversity. So these are all ornithuromorphs from the jet hole avifauna. We see taxa that seem to have almost lost their first digit. They're adapted for walking on the ground. We have birds with very elongate hind limbs. This is an illustration that suggests that they were wading birds. And we have taxa like Yanornis that were capable of flight, we can tell from their wings, but seem to have been probably flying underwater as well, or diving underwater to feed on fish. So just a lot of different ecologies represented, even though these birds are known from a lot less material. Now let's look at some of this exceptional preservation and how it's clued us into those three features that I told you I would talk about. So when we're looking at these exceptionally preserved soft tissues in fossils from the jet hole, the most common soft tissues that we find preserved are part of the integumentary system. The integumentary system is your skin and all its derivatives. So did you guys know that your skin is your biggest organ? Yeah, all right, I see some people nodding. Now, your skin has many functions, but one of the major functions of your skin is to be the interface between your body and the rest of the world. It's to protect all your much more vital organs from being damaged by all the harmful things in the world around us, right? So it is not surprising that the integumentary system is very often fossilized. So we have lots of specimens that preserve fossil feathers, we have specimens that preserve scales and skin, and in very rare instances, we have specimens that preserve the horny sheath on the beak. Now, with specimens that preserve feathers, we're actually able to identify molt. And molt is one of the most important biological features of birds, because birds' feathers not only help them fly, but they protect them from UV radiation, they allow them to camouflage into their environment, but feathers are dead structures so your hair and your fingernails are constantly growing, right? But a feather is so complex that the end of the feather is very different in shape than the beginning of the feather. And because of this difference, feathers can't continuously grow. So they have to grow and then they're dead. And that means once the dead feather is damaged, the only way to replace it is to grow a new one. And so birds have evolved to replace all their feathers once a year. Yes, they also replace their feathers when they're little babies and they're growing bigger and they need more feathers to cover their bodies, but adult birds only replace their feathers once a year. Now, focusing on the flight feathers and the way these are molted, you actually get clues as to the lifestyle of the bird. So if a bird needs to fly all the time, like if it can't fly, it will die, then it has a very distinctive type of molt in which it molts its feathers in a very regular sequence so that basically it's not molting too many feathers at once, so the wing can basically still be used to fly. Now birds like this cormorant here, which if they can't fly, it's okay. They can just dive in the water to escape predators. They molt their feathers in a irregular sequence, which actually helps them to molt faster, but when they're molting, they can't fly. So looking at the way the wing feathers are molted can help us understand the flight abilities of a living bird and also an extinct feathered dinosaur. So here is a flying people think it's flying. Here's a dromaeosaurid dinosaur named Microraptor that probably look like this. It's got wings on its arms and on its legs, and scientists hypothesize that this dinosaur could fly. And here we're looking at a molt gap, and this molt gap provides evidence that this bird was molting its feathers the same way that birds that need to fly molt their feathers. So this molt gap is providing evidence that supports the hypothesis that Microraptor was able to fly. And we also see the same thing in early birds. This is a Confuciusornis. Here we're seeing a molt gap, and we're seeing a sequential molt that, again, is supporting hypotheses that this bird could fly, and it could fly during its molt. Now, what's really interesting is that when we look at all these feathered dinosaurs, very, very, very few specimens show evidence of molt. And statistically speaking, the rarity of evidence of molt in the fossil record suggests that these early birds had not yet evolved an annual molt. So the annual molt we see in birds today is not a characteristic that can define birds. Now let's look at the digestive system. Now we've already talked about some of the unique characteristics, and we see that birds inherited the two-part stomach and the ability to move food in between different parts of the digestive system. These are things that were present in non-avian dinosaurs that birds inherited. But now let's look at this unique feature called the crop. Now the way that we understand or we interpret the digestive system in these birds is not by direct preservation of the stomach or the intestines or anything like that. The only way we're able to reconstruct the digestive system is through ingested remains. So we find things that these birds have swallowed in different parts of their digestive system, and this helps us understand what it looked like. So for example, here is an ornithomorph bird called Yanornis, and inside its esophagus, we have two whole fish. And this is exactly like what we see in living birds that eat fish. Basically, the entire esophagus can distend to hold their food, fish. Now, birds that eat seeds don't have a distinct esophageal crop that isn't the whole esophagus. It's a pouch that's located only in the bottom half of the esophagus. And looking at early birds, Cretaceous birds that preserve seeds, we see the exact same thing. Now, what's interesting is we see no evidence of a crop in any non-avian dinosaur. So maybe the crop is a feature that we can use to define birds. But Jehoornis, the second most primitive bird that we know of, preserves no evidence of a crop. However, there's also evidence that Jehoornis ate fruit, and birds that eat fruit don't have crops. So is the absence of crop in Jehoornis something that reflects the fact that the crop hasn't evolved yet, or is it a secondary loss? We need additional evidence to test whether or not a crop is a uniquely avian feature. But again, a crop's purpose serves to allow birds to eat more food than their stomachs can contain, which obviously is advantageous to animals that are using powered flight and need more energy for their unique form of locomotion. Now, for the remainder of this talk, I would like to focus on the reproductive system. So birds have, again, many unique features of the reproductive system. They have a single ovary and oviduct, as I've mentioned. They also have a unique structure called chelysa that holds the developing embryo in place within the egg. So, for example, a crocodile embryo will adhere to the inside of the top of the eggshell. And if you move the egg after the embryo has begun development, you will kill it. But birds hold the developing embryo in the middle of the egg, which allows the egg to be moved. And this is not just important because birds use contact incubation. This actually allows when you move the egg, it allows the embryo to absorb proteins from the egg white more rapidly, which means that incubation time is reduced. So the amount of time that the parent is vulnerable sitting on the egg incubating its clutch is reduced. So this is obviously advantageous. Birds also have something called medullary bone, which forms a calcium reservoir for them to create the eggshell, because their bones are so thin that they can't just absorb calcium throughout the skeleton the way that crocodilians do. Birds also have colored eggs, we've discussed that, and a high degree of parental care. So we hypothesize that the chaliza is only present in neornithines, the birds that survive, and we hypothesize that this is one of the reasons why they survive, but it's purely hypothetical. We don't have any evidence for it. There is some evidence that medullary bone is something birds inherited from non-avian dinosaurs. I don't buy it, but anyways. And I've already demonstrated that colored eggs and parental care are things birds inherited from dinosaurs. So let's focus on the single ovary and oviduct. So there were a number of specimens, actually, that I described over 10 years ago, where we find a cluster of circular objects always on the left-hand side of the body. Birds only have the left ovary, they don't have the right ovary, and it's always also positioned just underneath the vertebral column, so exactly where the left ovary is in living birds. So we hypothesize this is what we see preserved, and we also hypothesize that what is preserved are only the ovarian follicles, the yolks of the egg, that are about to be ovulated to form a clutch, because these ovarian follicles have a special membrane that's not present in immature follicles, and we hypothesize this is why they're fossilized. Now, this was important because one of the birds that we thought had ovarian follicles was Jeholornis. I know this is a terrible specimen, so a reminder, Jeholornis is the only Cretaceous bird with a long bony tail, and it's the bird that is just one step more derived than Archaeopteryx, so a very primitive bird. And also we have evidence from non-avian dinosaurs, from oviraptorosaurs, which are very closely related to birds, that they had two functional ovaries and oviducts. And this is not only because we see clear pairing of eggs in the nest, but there are also some specimens that preserve two eggs in between the pelvic canal that is interpreted as having two eggs being basically being ready to be laid at the time of death in these animals. So this is really cool because this allows us to narrow down when the right ovary and oviduct was lost in theropod evolution. And it helps us to narrow it down very close to the appearance of flight. And the reason this is interesting is because ornithologists, for decades, long before we knew that birds were dinosaurs, they had hypothesized that the only reason birds have a single ovary and oviduct is to reduce their body mass in order to help flight. And now, from the fossil record, we have strong evidence to support this, and also evidence that suggests that maybe this evolved very early in avian evolution, and this may be a characteristic that defines birds, something that sets all birds apart from non-avian dinosaurs. Now, just in case there's any theropod nerds out there, maybe you heard that troodontids only have a single ovary and oviduct. I've also seen that research presented at conferences, but never published, so we'll have to wait till that actually happens. I'm open to the story changing, but yeah. So some of you may be thinking, ovarian follicles, egg yolks before they become part of the egg, how can that fossilize? And if you're thinking that, you wouldn't be alone. And so there was somebody who immediately contradicted us and were like, no, these are obviously ingested food items preserved inside the stomach. And that is the most obvious interpretation, and there are a long list of reasons why we did not favor that interpretation, which I'm not going to read to you, because controversy is good for science. If people disagree, it means the currently available evidence is not clear enough to show who is right. So it means that we must get additional evidence. This is what pushes science forward. So I love controversy. So this is exactly what we did. We went ahead and we extracted pieces of these things that we thought were ovarian follicles. We also extracted pieces of seeds so we could test whether or not they were seeds, and we extracted an embryo from a living bird, so we also had comparative tissues from a living bird. One thing that maybe you don't know, this is a very new technique within paleontology. If you take an extracted sample of a fossil and you dissolve away the hard part, then you can actually cut it very, very thin, like 10 microns thin, and you can apply the same histochemical stains that biologists apply to living tissues to study them. You can apply them to fossils. So here is the perifollicular membrane that we thought led to the preservation of these follicles in a chicken with Mason's trichome applied to it, right? So this is, if you did not apply a stain, you wouldn't see any of these beautiful colors bonding with different types of tissues. Here is our sample from this fossil bird, unstained. Here it is stained. And you can see that this structure looks very, very similar to what we hypothesized it represented in the early bird. And we also even have the stain reacting the same way as in the living tissue, which also suggests that original biomolecules of these tissues are still preserved in this bird that is 120 million years old. Now, this is something that definitely needs to be tested further, but I personally think it is a very exciting frontier for paleontology. Now, this allows us to test hypotheses because determining sex in a reptile is very difficult to do. It's very difficult to tell if a fossil dinosaur is a male or female without reproductive specific tissues. But having ovarian follicles, which are only present in females, allows us to test hypotheses concerning the sexual dimorphism of plumage. So it's been hypothesized that these really cool tail feathers are only present in males, and here we have evidence that they're absent in these two female birds. It also helps us support interpretations about the difference in growth strategies between birds and non-avian dinosaurs. So dinosaurs take a very long time to grow to full size, and they can start reproducing before they reach adult size, which is the opposite of what we see in living birds. And here we have cut the bone of this reproductively active enantiornithine bird, and we see a bird that is still actively growing even though it's reproductively active, showing that these early birds were more like dinosaurs than they were like birds in terms of their life strategy. And when we put all these fossils together, we see that these early birds lived in a way that's totally different than the birds we see alive today. Now, why is this important? This is important because these birds with totally different lifestyles, these enantiornithines, were the birds that go extinct in the end Cretaceous mass extinction. And so asking questions like, well, why did most dinosaurs go extinct? Or why did neornithines, why did crown birds survive? Or why did enantiornithines go extinct, are all questions that are absolutely relevant today because we are experiencing a mass extinction right now. The greatest problem facing humanity is our environmental crisis. And when we all choose to put our differences aside and work together to mitigate the effects of this mass extinction, the information that us paleontologists are gleaning by studying past mass extinctions are going to help us to they're going to help us to direct our conservation efforts by understanding which animals are most vulnerable to extinction and how other groups of organisms are affected by a closely related group or dependent group going extinct. All this information that only paleontologists can glean from past mass extinctions are going to be tools that can help us through our environmental crisis. Now, thank you. All right. I just want to say that everywhere I've gone in Seattle, I'm like, can I use I brought my own coffee cup, and they're like, yeah, no problem. And they don't let me do that in Illinois. So you guys in Washington, you're a step ahead of us. But I just want to say one last thing. You might be saying, well, all the fossils you just showed us are from the Jurassic or the early Cretaceous, and that is far predates the actual extinction. So why aren't you telling us about fossils that are closer to the extinction event that happened 66 million years ago? Well, it's because we barely have any fossils from that period of time, and that's why I'm out there in the Hell Creek looking for fossil birds that were present when this meteor hit our planet to really understand what the birds were like at this time of extinction. And that's how I got connected to your wonderful paleontologist, Gregory Wilson Mantilla, and he has collected birds that he has generously let me look at, and the fossils that I've seen on this visit actually are going to be very important for helping us to better understand this selectivity of the end Cretaceous mass extinction. And I just really want to say it's so wonderful when paleontology truly works as a collaborative science. So thank you so much for listening, and I really look forward to any questions that you may have.